Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to CCS Fundraising's Perspectives on Philanthropy, Giving USA 2026. Thank you very much for joining us today on release day of this year's Giving USA findings. I'm Peter Hoskow, President and Chief Operating Officer at CCS Fundraising. For nearly 80 years, CCS has partnered with nonprofit organizations across all sectors to advance transformational change through philanthropy. We're proud to support Giving USA and deeply grateful for our longstanding collaboration with the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, whose research and analysis continue to provide the sector with one of the most important annual resources. I had the privilege personally of serving on the Board of Visitors for 6 years at the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy and know well how important their work is to us all. I also want to acknowledge everyone joining us today: nonprofit leaders, board members, fundraisers, donors, advisors, and partners across the sector. The work of advancing missions and serving communities has never been a simple one. It requires leadership, discipline, creativity, resilience, generosity, and a clear understanding of the environment in which we are operating. This is why today's conversation really matters for all of us. Giving USA 2026 shows that philanthropy remained remarkably resilient in 2025. Giving rose again, and it rose significantly. At the same time, the trends beneath that growth reveal important shifts for nonprofit leaders to consider. The data does not give us one simple narrative. Rather, it gives us a more complex and nuanced picture. Record giving, shifting donor participation, growth in bequests, meaningful growth in bequests, continued strength in foundation giving, and a funding environment that remains complex for many, many organizations. So today, we'll focus not only on what happened, but what does this mean? And what does it mean for different types of organizations and leaders across those organizations? What should nonprofit leaders take from this year's findings? How should organizations think about donor engagement, revenue diversification, campaign strategy, planned giving, and long-term resilience? And where should CEOs, boards, and development leaders focus their energy now? In a moment, Jon Bergdoll from the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy will walk us through the data. After that, we'll move into a panel discussion with leaders who bring important perspectives from community foundations, healthcare philanthropy, and higher education advancement. Thanks to these three leaders, we'll say a bit more about them after Jon's report delivery, but I want to thank Dexter Bailey Jr. of Caltech, Brent Christopher of Children's Medical Center Foundation, Dallas, Rebecca Fishman-Lipsey of the Miami Foundation. A few quick logistics before I hand it to Jon and we begin. Today's session is being recorded, and the recording and the slides will be made available after the event. Please feel free to use the Q&A feature throughout the session. Let your thoughts and questions be known. While we will not take questions live from the audience during the panel discussion, our team at CCS will collect and curate those questions, and will make responses available following the webinar. Now, I'm very pleased to introduce Jon Bergdoll. Jon is Interim Director of Data and Research Partnerships at the Indiana University Lilly School of Philanthropy. He joined the school's research team in 2015 as an applied statistician. For the past decade, he served as a lead analyst for Giving USA. His work focuses on the measurement of philanthropic giving, data analytics, and policy analysis. Jon brings both technical expertise, and you will soon see a very accessible perspective on what the data means for all of us. Jon, thanks a ton. Thanks for being with us. And with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Peter, and thanks to all of you for watching. I'm going to walk through the report. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the trends, both some of the more short-term, immediate trends, some longer-term things. And near the start, we'll also step back a little bit and bring in some information and data from outside of what we report on in Giving USA to provide a little bit of even broader context for some of what we are seeing in the field right now. So let's go ahead and get started. Next slide, please. So we'll start with just the big picture element of things. Next slide. And we'll start with the easiest part of the big picture, which is that total giving number. So charitable giving totaled $617.20 billion in 2025. This is the first time it's surpassed 600 billion, and this is a high in current dollars. It's up 5.7% from 2024, which when adjusting for inflation is about 3%. It is worth noting, when adjusting for inflation, this is only the second highest year on record, with 2021 still being a very remarkable year for giving and still having that sort of title as the largest year, at least adjusting for inflation. Let's go on. So with Giving USA, we really look at things in two buckets. We have the sources, which is sort of where the money is coming from, and we'll focus on that first. And then later in the presentation, we'll talk a little bit more about the uses, or what sort of charities the money is going to. So with the sources, we slice things up into four categories. You'll notice that donor advised funds is not listed here. For the sources, the way we count donor advised funds is that we count that donation at the original source of the donation, at the original time of the donation. And what that means is that for the most part, this is going to be counted as individual giving. There are a handful of corporate owned and ran DAFs, but they're still a pretty small minority of things. The vast bulk of DAF giving is coming from individuals. So on the subject of individuals, they do remain the large majority of giving at 64%. And in 2025, this was almost $400 billion, $394.20 billion. It is worth noting, even though that this is by far the largest share of giving, that this share has gone down over the years. Depending on if you want to talk 40 years or 20 years, or even just 5 years, this share has steadily gone down. And we can move along to foundations at 19%. They are the main recipients of it. We have seen foundation giving really grow over the past 20 years from well under 10% to now 19% of giving. It was 117.15 billion in 2025, and it's been in excess of that 100 billion now for 4 years running. No real signs of that changing. Next, we have at 10% bequest at 62.19 billion. It's worth knowing that this is a little bit of an increase in that share of giving represented by bequest compared to 4 or 5 years ago. We are also starting to see pretty large growth in bequest, and we'll talk a lot more about that one later on in the presentation. And then finally, at 7%, the smallest of our four sources we track, we have corporate giving. This does include giving by corporate foundations. And this was at about 44 billion in 2025, 43.67%, or around 7%, which is about where it's been the last year or two. Let's go forward. Looking at growth rates, we saw that all four sources did grow in current dollars. When we adjust for inflation, you'll notice corporations is a little bit more marginal there. It was still positive, but it was at 0.5%, which we kind of consider closer to flat than a real increase. When you look at the amounts, I'm sure everyone is noticing the same thing, which is that while giving was lifted a little bit by foundations, it was really lifted by bequest in 2025. Bequest grew almost 20% in current dollars, 19.7%. And 16.6% when adjusted for inflation. So really large growth there from bequest. Individuals was at 4.1%, so solid too. Let's go to the next slide. So I'm sure most folks on this call have heard donors down, dollars up. We just covered the dollars up portion of things. Let's talk a little bit about the donors down portion of things. The data on this slide come from two separate studies ran by the school. One is the Philanthropy panel study. That's a more general population study, and that's that lower bar. That's been in the field now since 2000, so we do have data going farther back than this. And the bar above that is from our Bank of America high net worth study, and we really highlight that data from 2016 and on. And the reason why I wanted to have this chart to show both of them, the donors down part in the general population, I think is pretty well known. In our data, we have it really kicking off in 2008. At that point, about 2/3 of households gave on an annual basis. You flash forward to the present, and we're down to around 50% of households giving. During most of that time frame, giving by affluent households or well-off households, whatever one slice you want to say, was a little bit steadier in those like mid 90%. What is really interesting is we now have a few waves of data that show following 2018 that the elements of donors down are starting to hit at the lower levels of that affluent tier. We are starting to see that donors down, dollars up, not just in the general population, but among the affluent as well. It remains to be seen what exactly is if it's just the exact same sort of demographic trend starting to hit the wealthy as well, if it's more the definition we use of affluent is starting to look a little bit more general population-y on the low end of things. But it's interesting to see that even among the wealthy, we are starting to see that split emerge of the donors down, dollars up. Go to the next slide. So on the other end of that split on it are the ultra high net worth. There's a variety of measurements you can use out there to see that the major donors or the ultra high net worth, or whatever, however you want to say it, are giving a larger and larger share of giving. Here we are sort of focusing on mega giving, partly because this is a Giving USA presentation, and I got to talk about mega giving at some point anyway, so it's convenient to do it here, and also because it illustrates it pretty well, I think. As a reminder, what mega giving is in Giving USA, we look at all gifts that are above 0.1% of total giving. So in this year, that's 600 million or above. And we make sure that our data, when it's not finalized historical data, is accounting for those gifts. And for 2025, that total was almost $20 billion for the individuals. It was, I think, 19.2 or something. And what we can see from this chart is that that is in line with where it has been post pandemic. We really see that 2020 as a sea change. Prior to 2020, it had never hit even $5 billion. And since 2020, we have never been below $10 billion. So there was a real change there. And the effects of this sort of ultra high net worth distribution of giving are seen outside of just individual giving too. You can see that a little bit in terms of that growing share of foundation giving, both in terms of giving to foundations, also the giving from. Similarly with DAFs, you can also see it a little bit in the sort of organizations receiving support. I think the clearest sign of this is that shrinking share that religious giving represents, not because the wealthy don't give to religion, but because among wealthy donors, religious giving tends to be a smaller share of their overall giving. So as they're responsible for more of giving, we see that share come down. Let's go on to the next slide. So this is the one graph I have in my slides that isn't from a study we've done or anything, and it's because I really love this graph. It's from a white paper put out by Dan Hungerman up at Notre Dame last year. And this is a really clean representation, I think, of just how much we are seeing that high net worth shift of things. I imagine most folks have heard of the 80-20 rule, where 80% of your dollars are coming from 20% of your donors. That was the truism when I came into the field, although I think even at that point, people were talking about that being a little bit dusty. If you look at this data, you can see that bottom, what this is representing is the share of the data. He had got access to really great IRS data, really comprehensive data on individual donors. And what this is showing is the share of the giving in the full sample that's coming from the top little percentiles of giving. So at the far left side, that represents the top 10% of the donors in the sample. And what that vertical axis is that share of the giving that they represent, and going all the way over to the 99th and 100th percentile. So we'll start on that left side. What we see there in 2008 on that bottom line is that that top 10% was responsible for about 2/3 of all giving in the sample, which correlates pretty well with about 80-20. This is already pretty high, but this is kind of what the norm was. Going forward 12 years, which now is 6 years ago still, so wherever this trend is at now, go forward 6 years, you can see just how much that has expanded. It's not even 80-10, it's beyond that. It's almost, in this data, 90% of the dollars in the sample coming from the top 10% of donors, which is a huge shift. What I also find interesting is going down to the right there a little bit. If you look right between that 98 and 100, that's going to be about the 99th percentile. That's about the top 1% of donors in this sample. If you look at that bottom line there in 2008, looks like the top 1% were responsible for about 1/3 of the giving in the sample. That's already pretty impressive in a way. But if you look ahead to that 2020, right now, 6 years ago even, about half of the giving in this huge sample was from the top 1% of donors. And since 2020, there is really no reason or data to suggest that this trend has in any way ameliorated. I'm not going to go so far as to say that it's, even gone farther than this, but I would be far less surprised by it going farther than this than, it getting better since 2020. So, that's the sort of scale we are at. And an element I always like to point out with this is that this discrepancy and this growing discrepancy makes it harder as a practitioner to contextualize the sort of data and research that you read about the sector because there's now a split. If you're reading a survey of donors and it's talking about what the typical donor is doing, that no longer is going to be reflective of what the dollars are doing. And similarly, if you look at where the dollars are going, that might not hit the same as the mood among the normal donor that you're talking to. There's now this disconnect there. Sometimes those things are in alignment, but not always. And it's always worth keeping that in mind anytime you're reading about any study that's looking at just one or just the other. Let's go forward. So that was my broad context spiel, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. I'll keep it short on that one. Basically, we talked about the donors down, dollars up thing. We are expecting the One Big Beautiful Bill Act to be a little bit dollars down, donors up eventually, in terms of about a $5 billion a year down on that one in net, but adding several million more donors to it. That said, we don't anticipate those things coming into play right away. Most of that didn't even come into effect until 2026, and people aren't going to change their behaviors for that for several more years. The only real effect we expect in 2025, we do anticipate about $2 billion in retimed giving to have gone from, to have been given in excess in 2025. But for an operating charity, that's not really going to manifest, I suspect, because the motivation of that giving being purely tax and not need driven, the bulk of that giving is almost certainly going to go into giving vehicles like foundations and DAFs to be granted out more when the donor was originally planning to give that money away. But all right, let's go forward one slide, please, to start talking a little bit more detail about the sources in Giving USA. So we'll start off with individual giving, the biggest slice. So in 2025, individual giving did grow, though it's worth noting that it trailed total giving. It went up 4.1% compared to the 5.7% of total giving. And this is solid. This is good. I don't want to poo-poo this. But we had 16% growth in the S&P 500. And on top of that, that's after 2 other years of really strong market growth. With that many years in a row in strong market growth, we would kind of anticipate individual giving to look a little bit more robust than this. And we don't have a super, we don't know for sure. But looking at it, part of it is because while the markets have been really strong, this has been a little bit of a stranger economy. GDP was much more modest, at around 4% as well. Same with disposable income. And then consumer sentiment, which is a good proxy for more like how the median household is doing and feeling, was really terrible. It dropped 21% and it dropped to the lowest level on record for a full year that's in that data series. And that data series goes back to the 1950s. So from a consumer sentiment perspective, 2025 was truly, truly abysmal. And I think that this almost certainly is reflected in some decisions households made about whether or not to give. Giving comes from a place of financial security. And if you don't feel like you have that, more typical households are going to make that choice to give less or not give. And so that almost certainly is reflecting of something that would have drugged down individual giving a little bit in 2025, despite the otherwise strong economy. Let's go forward a slide. I did promise we were going to talk about bequests more, following through on that. Bequests had a very strong single year, and they've also had strong recent growth. As mentioned, bequests grew almost 20% in 2025, 16.6% when you adjust for inflation to over 60 billion. If you've been on these before, we don't normally talk about single year values with bequest. Bequest data is really noisy. It's just inherent in what that data is measuring. You see a lot of peaks and valleys there. And so a single year is really tough to interpret in any direction. But we have seen really strong growth with bequest on both the recent, somewhat medium term, and longer term. In 3 of the last 4 years, we have seen bequest grow 20% or more in current dollars. That's a lot of giving in a very short period of time. Um, and if we look a little bit farther out, we still see that stronger giving, not quite as strong as that, but when we look at these sort of 5 year pools where we sort of pool all the dollars together into these 5 year lumps, and that sort of smooths out those peaks and valleys that are with bequest, what we see is from the past 10 years, bequests in each of those periods have outperformed overall giving by about 10 percentage points. So it's not just this year, and it's not even just the last 4 or 5 years that we have seen such strong bequest growth. It really is, at this point, a 10-year plus phenomenon of a slow increase, though now it is a less slow increase. It seems to be quite fast. Let's go to the next. With foundations, we are seeing more of a steady increase from them, but it's really resulted in strong cumulative growth. So for 2025, we see giving by foundations growing by 5.7%, the same as overall giving, 3% when adjusted for inflation, and that hitting 117 billion. We've seen market growth of the last few years really helping elevate foundation giving through both donations to foundations being very high, but also through growth in those asset sizes. And I would say, if anything, the tone of recent years has really been, why, given all of this, are foundations not increasing their giving more? I'd say I even contributed to that with some talking points from last year, and I stand, and that is a valid approach to that data. I think that's a valid critique. But something that I noticed when putting together the data for this year is that while we've had a lot of modest years of growth in terms of giving by foundations, what we haven't had are any decreases. You have to go back 15 years in the data to find a year in which foundations gave less than they did the year prior. It's just growth on growth. So even when it is fairly moderate growth and fairly modest growth, because it is just piling on top of each other without ever having that, big 10-year drop in things it has to recover from, the cumulative effect has been really strong. And so not only, are we at like 117 billion now, if you look back over that 15-year period of time, in current dollars, that's almost tripled. That you look at 2010, it was about $40 billion. We're now nearly at 120 billion. So I think there is a little bit of a force for the trees here with recent years of foundation of, yes, foundation assets have grown a lot. Maybe we would anticipate a little bit faster of growth from the dollars, but where those dollars are at relative to where they have been, that growth has been there. So whether or not there should be more or not is a different conversation, but I want to highlight that we have seen really strong growth there in foundations. It's just kind of slow motion a little bit. Let's go forward, please. And finally, for wrapping up on the sources end of things, we'll talk a little bit about corporate giving. Corporate giving grew the least of all of our sources this year, 3.1%, kind of flat at a positive 0.5% when you adjust for inflation. This was still a record amount even when adjusting for inflation, just not by a huge amount. It's worth noting, despite the fact that it did grow the least of those sources, you look over the last 5 years, they have easily had the strongest growth. You look at the 5 year annualized rates, it's almost 10% in current dollars. Foundations are the next at 7.3, individuals only at 4%. They're, in that longer term, they're doing just fine. It just kind of was a more tepid year for a variety of reasons, probably. That said, I always like to caveat whenever I talk about how huge corporate giving has been over the last few years with a couple things. One is this element that this growth has coincided with a really large expansion in terms of the dollars being donated via pharmaceuticals, by in-kind donations of pharmaceuticals through patient assistance plans. This is something we track on the uses side under a category called to individuals, which is a bad name for that category. It predates my time on this project and also predates most modern crowdfunding platforms. So everyone just thinks it's crowdfunding, and they're right to think that, but it's not. It's pharmaceutical in-kind donations. That series has grown, from 10 billion to about 25 billion. And so that growth is certainly a big chunk of what's fueling this corporate giving growth. So a more standard charity that's getting those cash grants from corporations probably has not necessarily seen this same growth in largesse as perhaps these top line numbers would indicate. And the other caveat I'll give is on the next slide, please. This period of growth has also coincided with really, really strong corporate pre-tax profit growth. And so you can see there, you can look back to 2015. it has the percentage being given of corporate pre-tax profits growing. Sure, it went up a little bit. Does this look like a huge spike in giving that maybe that 10% annual giving growth would suggest? No, it looks a lot more modest. And this is really part of it where it's just that large growth of giving is also being reflected in that large growth in corporate pre-tax profits. Let's go on to the next slide. So that was sources. Now we're going to move on to talking about the recipients of giving. I'm just going to walk through this pie chart first, and then we'll go into a little bit more details about some specifics. So going from largest to smallest, we'll start with religion, which was at over 150 billion in 2025, about 23% of overall giving. By far the largest chunk of giving, but again, worth emphasizing, this has come down as a share of giving quite a lot over the last 40 years. Religion was easily a majority of giving for quite a while of American history. At this point, it is now down to less than a quarter, and it does seem like that is a trend that doesn't necessarily show signs of abating anytime soon. But 23% still quite a bit larger than 15%, which is our next place at human services at almost $100 billion. Human services has really had a strong chunk of years following from the pandemic forward. Prior to the pandemic, they were often kind of a little bit below education or right around education for that second largest spot. Since the pandemic, they have been the second largest subsector consistently, even if not necessarily by a huge number of dollars. There in third, we have third largest, we have education, about $92 billion in 2025, or 14% of the pie. It had a pretty strong year. Next, at 12%, we have gifts to foundations at about 79 billion. This series tends to be a little bit noisy. It's kind of related to bequest in that way for a lot of the same reasons, but it did pretty strongly as just a share of things. Next, we have 11% public society benefit at 72 billion. This is where I'll give the DAF spiel for the uses side of things. So the way that we handle DAF gifts on the uses side of things is for each subsector, we take the net of DAF grants coming into donor advised funds and subtract out the grants coming out of them. And we just apply that net version of it. And this is to avoid double counting those grants coming out because we are counting them elsewhere at their final destination. The reason why I highlight that as public society benefit is because this is the category in which we are counting, while we also count things like civil rights organizations or standalone research institutions. This is the category where things like United Ways and the national DAFs are counted. So your Fidelities, your Vanguards. And so the bulk of DAF dollars are in this category. We do count community foundations under the gifts to foundations. And most other subsectors do have a handful of DAF sponsoring organizations within them where we are counting DAF gifts. Those tend to be much smaller single issue or even single organization DAFs. So while they're important, they aren't necessarily moving the numbers quite as much as the national stuff and public society benefit. But that is where that category is. Following that, we have at 9% health at 61, almost 62 billion. We have international affairs next at 33 billion or 5%. Worth highlighting here on international affairs that what we mean by that is not a nonprofit that is located in another country. Giving USA tracks gifts to US 501c3s, and so that is that is going to represent gifts to US 501c3s that are internationally focused. Now, in practice, a lot of those organizations are friends of organizations that really exist to process those donations and send them to that international org. So they're very similar in that regard. But from a technical perspective, worth highlighting here, this is not donations going directly internationally. Next, then at 4%, we have arts and culture at 27 billion, environment and animals at about 25 billion, which is up from the 3% they've been at for a while. And then also at 4%, we have that to individuals category at 26 billion that I just mentioned a couple slides back. Again, this is really representative of in-kind donations of pharmaceuticals that are then distributed directly to patients or individuals through patient assistance programs. They're counted here because otherwise we'd kind of lose track of them between the sources and the uses. So they used to be much more of an adjustment. They've really grown into their own category at this point. Let's go to the next slide. So getting into the weeds a little bit for highlighting a couple of the uses here. I want to highlight with religion. I talked a little bit already about religious share of giving coming down. And what I always used to say with religion was that it's still growing. It's just not growing as fast as everything else. And that's why its share is coming down. But really, once you adjust for inflation, looking back over things, that is kind of no longer true that much. Cumulative speaking, for the last 20 years, so going back to 2005, religious giving has only grown by 1% over that 20-year time frame. The next lowest is arts and culture at 33%. So 1% versus 33%. You have four sectors in there, subsectors in there: foundations, human services, public society, benefit, and environment animals, that have basically doubled or more during that same time frame that religion has been perfectly flat in terms of giving power. So really, I was struck by the fact that this has really started to level off as a series. Go forward, please. That's talking about one of the sectors that went down a little. Let's talk about the ones that went up the most. We have education, public society, benefit, and environment animals all experienced the most growth among the subsectors in 2025. They all had 10% or more in current dollar growth. Um, the sort of shared element here of these three is that these are also the three that have seen the largest annualized growth over the last 5 years. And so, really, what we were seeing in 2025 from a subsector perspective was the stuff that has been doing well continued to do pretty well. So, kind of a non-story story there to some degree, but it is worth highlighting the continued success of those subsectors. Let's go forward. Uh, with Giving to Foundations, we actually saw a really big drop in Giving to Foundations, almost 20% drop. It went down 18.3% when you adjust for inflation in 2025. The reason why I don't necessarily highlight that or make as much of a big deal out of that is that not only is it that, Giving to Foundations is a little bit noisy, a little bit jagged there, it was a drop from a really, really huge high. And so, even at that big drop, it was still the third largest amount given to foundations in our entire data set. So, it dropped from 94 billion, but it's still at 79 billion, well above almost every other year. And really, with foundations, this is another place where you see that sea change that occurred in 2020. Prior to 2020, we never had a year of giving to foundations that hit $50 billion. And since 2020, we've never had a year of giving to foundations that didn't exceed 65 billion. So just a big jump up that stayed elevated there. And so even with that big drop, we are still at a very high level of giving to foundations in 2025. Let's go ahead to our last key finding here, sort of a wrap up of the uses. Just looking at the growth rates across all of the sectors, pretty broad growth. What we see is that even when adjusting for inflation, 7 of the 9 recipient categories grew. In current dollars, 8 of the 9 grew. So those declines were from foundations, and then when you adjust for inflation, religion a little bit. Everything else grew and grew pretty well, really. The only thing that was below 5% in current dollar growth was international affairs, and even it was at 4% and something. So pretty solid across the board growth with a couple of relatively big exceptions there. And yeah, go forward. And I believe that is the end of my portion. So happy to be part of the panel. I'll take a look at these Q&As and I'll hand it back to Peter.
Terrific. Thanks, Jon. Thanks for doing that. You, without question, bring the perspective of an applied statistician and bring it down to earth for many of us. So thank you. Thank you so much for the clear delivery and the relatability encapsulated in your presentation. Really grateful. There's a lot there, a lot of data for nonprofit leaders to absorb, no doubt. And what stands out to me is that there's no single storyline in what Jon presented to us, reflecting on the 2025 data, but instead there's many stories. Total giving reached a record level, but beneath that headline, we see shifting donor participation, meaningful growth in some areas, bequests in particular, foundations in particular, and of course the donor environment where organizations are increasingly needing to demonstrate a very clear line, a straight line from gift to impact. It's not getting easier. So I think the practical questions that I hope we can tackle together with this outstanding panel is, how should leaders read this? How should leaders respond? How should organizations build strength in clearly a market that is growing, but it isn't growing evenly? So I'm pleased to reintroduce this outstanding group of professionals and their really unique perspectives, joining us from across the philanthropic community. And we're gonna reflect on some of these findings and how they may be impacting their strategy, even though they've only just been published within the last few days. And Jon, I hope you'll stay with us because I suspect, actually, I know for certain we'll come back to you. So allow me to offer a bit of an introduction, more than just the name introduction offered earlier, of each of the three panelists that we're fortunate to have gathered here. Rebecca Fishman-Lipsey is president and CEO of the Miami Foundation, where she leads efforts to mobilize generosity and drive community impact across Greater Miami. Welcome, Rebecca. Since 2020, she's grown the foundation's assets by over 50% while advancing equity and collective impact. A former education policymaker and founder of Radical Partners, she began her career as a public school teacher and later served on the Florida Board of Education. Rebecca clearly is deeply committed to Miami and most proud of raising two kind, grounded sons alongside her husband. Thanks, Rebecca, for being with us. And Dexter A. Bailey Jr. is Vice President for Advancement and Alumni Relations at the California Institute of Technology, Caltech, as most commonly referred by most, a fundraising leader with more than 30 years of experience, including nearly 2 decades in senior leadership roles. He's led fundraising programs at public and private higher education institutions, and his expertise is broad, including fundraising leadership, institutional strategy, modern campaigns, and the role and experience of minorities in university advancement. Dexter, thanks so much for being with us and sharing your experience and perspective. And finally, Brent Christopher is president of Children's Medical Center Foundation in Dallas, leading fundraising efforts for children's health and its affiliated programs. Brent and his team have architected a historic joint campaign together with their academic medical partner to support a new $5.2 billion pediatric campus in Dallas. And we'll hear about some of that in our conversation, I hope. Brent joined the organization in 2016 after serving as president and CEO of Communities Foundation of Texas. During his tenure there, he helped grow North Texas Giving Day into a major community-wide fundraising initiative. His experience spans community foundations, healthcare philanthropy, and large-scale fundraising efforts. So, Brent, welcome. And Rebecca, Dexter, Brent, and Jon, again, thank you for joining us. I love to get the conversation going here. Jon, you just walked us through a year where total giving crossed $600 billion for the first time, but the composition, as you so well described, shifted in some notable ways. I'd like to focus first on individual giving, which actually grew more slowly than the overall total and slipped from 66% of the total picture to 64% of the total picture. So for Dexter, Brent, Rebecca, would love to just invite your reflection of this. And you're running organizations, you're doing so in diverse geographies with different donor bases and different missions each and every day. And so just with that diversity of perspective, would love to hear how you are reading the progression of individual giving, and how are you beginning to shift or adjust relative to this finding in the overall report?
All right, so I'll jump in to the awkward silence at the beginning and get us going. I will say our experience in Dallas at Children's Health mirrors the national trends. So we've had downward pressure on the number of individual donors, number of donors altogether at Children's Health now for many years. And the amount of giving, the dollars that have been given to Children's have been increasing, particularly in the form of the largest principal and transformational gifts that we have received over the last several years. So downward pressure on the number of donors, significant increases though in the dollars that have been given to Children's, and particularly by high net worth individuals. So we are tracking all of that. The challenge for us now is to figure out how to deal with those trends.
Excellent. Thank you, Brent, for getting us started. Dexter, you have a thought?
Yeah, absolutely. And once again, it's a pleasure to be here. Really appreciate this opportunity. To double down a little bit on what Brent said, we basically have embraced this trend. There's such high concentration amongst a very small number of people right now. So we've kind of built our program that way to put a kind of fine data point on it. We'll book anywhere from, let's say, 35 to 4,000 gifts a year, and typically anywhere from 4 to 7 will make up north of 50% of our total, which is, $400 to $500 million a year. So it's there, and I think that part of what we're seeing is also, as wealth is concentrated amongst these small number of people, I do wonder if some of that wealth is being transitioned into foundations and otherwise, that you're seeing a distribution of their wealth in different ways coming back into support philanthropy and nonprofits.
So I'll add a little color from the perspective of a community foundation. We're watching, where does the money go? So while at first blush, I look at Jon's data and I say, great, there's, increases all around money. It looks like there's more money available for nonprofits. Why wouldn't we celebrate that? If I look to see where the micro negative trends are, it's usually in the places where the funding is most flexible for organizations, and also in the places where it will hit the smaller and more grassroots organizations. So here in my community in Miami, more than 50% of our nonprofits are smaller neighborhood-based organizations. And I'm looking to pay attention to which sources of funding are most likely to hit them. And when there's decreases in places, individual giving is where the funding is most likely to hit, all the way down to the smallest organizations, and also where it's most likely to be flexible, general operating donations, which for our organizations, that's the trusting gifts that people are often giving that allow them the flexibility to do the things they know they need to do, as opposed to a more corporate style or bequest style gift where it's often programmatic or it's something specific and inflexible. And so even though it's a micro trend, I'm watching it carefully because I want to make sure, especially our neighborhood-based organizations who are doing really vital work across every single issue area, they need the funding in order to sustain.
Terrific, Rebecca. Thank you. Dexter, Rebecca, Brent clearly put immediately on display the idiosyncrasies and distinct nature of the organizations in which you are leading. Thank you. Thanks for getting us started. And it gives us, I think, a great jumping off point. Bringing it back to the holistic view, one of the notable findings is that total giving grew in 2025, including when adjusted for inflation. At the same time, a number of organizations, some of you just alluded to this, are navigating real challenges, some pretty gnarly challenges, such as costs, increased demand, and the inability to meet the demand of the organization's mission delivery, and just a more complex funding and fundraising environment. So Jon, if it's okay, turning back to you, looking at the data from this year, the data on which you just reported, but maybe even contemplating trends from the past few years, how should nonprofit leaders interpret the overall growth? Is it a sign of renewed momentum? Should we be spotting this as, cautious stability, given the resilience that we know so well about the overall philanthropy picture? Or is there more nuance we should bring into the frame?
I'm definitely going to err toward more nuance. I usually do. And I think Rebecca's comments really highlight that well, of different sources of giving give differently. And so where a lot of this nuance is felt is in ways that maybe aren't perfectly reflected in Giving USA, in particular, that size of the organization element. Something I think about a lot these days is that when you are sort of taking the same amount of giving and you're turning it from something that 10,000 people were doing to something that 10 people are doing, we do know that as people give more money, they give to more organizations. But it doesn't necessarily scale the same way that the money does. And so I would be pretty confident that those 10 individuals, even if they're giving the same amount as that 10,000, are giving it to a lot fewer organizations by number. And so what's really going to get hit here are those smaller and mid-sized organizations that now might more easily find themselves falling between the cracks of just missing out on having a major donor. And as far as trends forward for that, I think organizations like community foundations are really, really vital here, of serving as that bridge between major donors who do want to make a difference. They're, all of us know major donors. They're not these evil rapscallions or anything. They're people with a lot of money that a lot of them want to try to do good with it. And community foundations allow that much more easily to get that money out to a larger number of organizations than that donor would have by themselves. And they serve as a good bridge for that. So I don't know the degree to which the world of community foundations is going to be able to ably distribute this out and try to fend off that coming onslaught of the small organization collapse, but I think it will at least ameliorate that.
John, thanks. Really helpful. I was predicting that you would choose door number 3, which is more nuance. Thank you.
Why
Thank you.
why would I talk less when I could talk more?
No, thank you. Thank you for opening the door. And Rebecca, let's go further down the path. Community foundations, without question, do sit at a unique intersection in this data and in the nonprofit ecosystem as connectors to the donor pipeline and advocates for organizations most dependent on broad participation, as you mentioned earlier. So the data shows us that giving is concentrating at the top. Dexter, your experience and your shop's production reflects a very acute view of that as well. But Rebecca, at the Miami Foundation, you run one of the country's most active community-wide giving programs with 120,000 donations last year and a median gift of $50. So thank you for that leadership and congrats on that really important threshold level of participation. What does this divergence, this overall divergence, tell us about the health of the philanthropic ecosystem? And for organizations that are small, ones that are grassroots in focus or neighborhood based, that may never appear in a mega donors philanthropic outlook, what role do community foundations play in keeping them in the funding conversation?
Yeah, Peter, it is such a good question, and I feel a huge sense of responsibility to get this part right. I'm looking at Jon's data and the amount of wealth being transferred in this moment in time right now. This is a generational moment of massive wealth transfer. And we're going to see and continue to see huge amounts of dollars coming out through bequests. The majority of the nonprofits that are tuning in today have never received a bequest. And are not sure what their pipeline is with which to be put in someone's legacy plan. And then when you look to see where are those dollars going, where are they not going, and how can we make sure that when that wealth is passed down either in this generation or to the next generation, which is going to distribute it out, that organizations that are smaller and grassroots and neighborhood-based actually can get a share of that pie. And there's a handful of things we think about. One is as a community foundation, we're housing, let's say for us at the Miami Foundation, 1,000 families philanthropy, and they have announced their intent to give, and we can watch where they're giving and support they're giving each year to the organizations they already have a relationship with. And we can be passive in that, or we can be active. If I know and can see that you care about the environment, and I see which organizations are naturally coming to mind for you, we have the ability then to introduce you to other organizations you may never have heard of. And similarly, if I have a relationship with the grandparents of a family, am I waiting until they pass away with which to introduce myself to the children and then the grandchildren, and then to introduce them as well to organizations on the ground? And so it would encourage, whatever neighborhood you're in, I imagine there's hopefully an institution like ours that has relationships with those who are incredibly wealthy and who have expressed an intent to give and are amassing resources with which to give back. And we want you to get in front of them and to be having conversations with them, not just about their giving this year, but what do you want your legacy to be in your lifetime? And I see you're already interested in and engaged with these organizations. What is it about those organizations? Can I introduce you to this one you might not have heard of yet? And also, why don't we engage your next generation now and have conversations with them now? And the greatest gift that we can give to somebody's lifetime legacy is not just the gift you're going to give, but what will your future generations do with which to honor the things that you care about now? Let's have those conversations already.
Inspiring, Rebecca, an awesome and clear illustration of the invaluable role that community foundations serve as conveners, as thought leaders, and as mentioned, connectors. Thanks for that perspective. And again, thanks for your leadership in advancing that all-important cause in Miami. Brent, would love, if it's okay, to sort of square the circle here and to think about it from both ends of the donor continuum, from transformational, principal, major, and planned gifts for just a moment. You are, as mentioned, you're in the middle of one of the largest healthcare capital campaigns in the country. And as we heard from Jon, health overall just hit an all-time high in terms of received philanthropic dollars in 2025. And so from where you sit, and I think in particular through the lens of your current experience in Dallas towards a new pediatric campus, what is actually driving the growth in health giving? Is it primarily being carried by those transformational major gifts, or is there meaningful broad-based participation? And I think really bringing it home, Brent, as we know, your campaign will move from a quiet focused effort to a more broad-based effort. And as you think about that transition, what's the strategy for engaging broader Dallas community members around a project of this scale and around a project of this importance?
Sure. Thanks, Pete. So it makes me a little nervous and uncomfortable for you to put me at the opposite end of the spectrum from Rebecca, because I loved what Rebecca had to say and the work that is being done at the Miami Foundation. So that is critical and important. I'll give a little context, though, to build on what you've just described about what's going on here for Children's Health in Dallas. We're the not-for-profit, academically affiliated, comprehensive health system for kids, right? We're the safety net for all kids, regardless of the neighborhood where they live in the Dallas region. And our flagship campus opened in the mid-1960s. So that was 60 years ago, and the region has continued to grow a whole lot. So we're in the process now of investing along with our academic partner in a brand new, comprehensive, really enormous pediatric campus that has a $5.2 billion price tag on it. And the partners, our academic partner and Children's Health together, have been able to come up with a combination of assets that total around $4 billion. But to get to the full price tag on what it's going to take to bring this new campus to life, we have to raise another $1 billion from the community. So those are big numbers. Those are numbers that are hard for a lot of organizations to relate to, a lot of donors to relate to. And yet this is the kind of massive infrastructure project, right, at a scale that is significant to every household, every child, every family across an enormous region. And this is what it takes to bring it to life. That said, the fundraising success that we've had so far in this campaign to raise $1 billion in community philanthropy has been driven by the major and principal and really transformational gifts. So we won't go public probably for another year and a half. At this point, I mean, we're all fundraisers by and large on this call. So I'll say out loud at this point, we've raised $770 million toward that $1 billion goal, right? And out of that $770 million, about $600 million of that came from 10 donors. So again, to illustrate the point that we've been talking about all along, those principal and transformational gifts have been huge drivers. And in our case, 4 of those gifts are 9-figure gifts, which honestly just knocks my socks off, right? The fact that for a not-for-profit capital project, we have had 4 separate individual families step up with 9-figure gifts, I don't know when that's ever happened. It's crazy. And that is what has propelled us to the point where we can now prepare to invite the broader community in. That is critically important, though, because this is not the safety net hospital for high net worth kids and families. This is the safety net hospital for every kid and every family. And so Dallas needs to have skin in the game. Everybody in this community needs to have skin in the game and to know that there is a role they can meaningfully play, whether they have $100 to give or $100,000 to give or $100 million to give. There's a place for you. We're about to move into that part of it. And honestly, I think it's going to take more peer-to-peer strategies. For us, that's where we're really beginning to kind of double down. We know those work, obviously, for the principal gifts that have come in so far, and those are more traditional maybe in that context. But we are really beginning to explore ways to invest in peer-to-peer strategies across the entire spectrum of giving as a way to help push this out across the community when we do go public, and I think that will be critical. We're also investing, this is, kind of taboo to talk about in some ways, but we're investing in an AI-driven virtual engagement officer that will make it easier for people to give, particularly smaller gifts at a higher volume. no one will be misled into thinking that they are not dealing with an AI-driven virtual engagement officer. That will be transparent and obvious, but it will make it simple to get the information you want from us about how you want your gift to make an impact and to smooth out that transactional experience and help us do a better job then of qualifying donors and to know how to begin to build individual relationships where we need to.
Really terrific, Brent, and congratulations to Children's Health and to the vision of the new pediatric campus and the remarkable threshold generosity demonstrated by the 4 gifts you mentioned and the many others that those have helped inspired. And I think it's clear that we know in fundraising, success begets success and momentum generates more momentum. And so there's great confidence that the strategy that you've deployed thus far will also have great impact on the broad-based outreach that the public face will carry. Congrats on the success. Dexter, I'm coming to you, if it's okay. Your role in leadership within higher ed advancement, we're seeing that education is one of the standout stories in this year's report, up better than 11.7% in current dollars. And it's an all-time high, even after adjusting for inflation. And this is occurring despite what we all know is a pretty turbulent environment for higher ed right now overall, but also as it relates to philanthropy and funding. So what's your read on higher education giving overall? And why is this show of resilience so clear in this moment? And as you think about Caltech's donor base, you mentioned it earlier, particularly aging alumni, how are you adjusting planned giving and gift officer strategy to capture more of the bequest and wealth transfer activity that we're seeing in the space?
Yeah, thank you so much. And you told me this was going to be easy and I was going to be able to hang intellectually, but this is a great panel. So thank you for doing this. So let me sheepishly try to answer with the same level of intelligence as our other panelists. Let me start with the latter first. We have, built our planned giving program and our foundation program. So I'd like to say that I had the insights of Jon and the level of sophistication, but the lesson here is to know your organization, understand your donor base, and through studying the trends that we were seeing locally at Caltech, it made a lot of sense for me to make investments in those areas. So for example, Caltech depends heavily on friends of the institutions and not alums. Historically, since our founding, there were 100 families that came together with our founding president and some of our local very influential barons, and they made unrestricted gift, commitments to help launch what we know as Caltech today. So it's always been part of our DNA. Today, we have about 1,700 families around the world who are part of what we call the Caltech Associates, and they continue to support, and it's been an unbelievable pipeline. So having said that, one of the reasons I'm bringing that up is that alums from Caltech have historically been very, very generous through their bequest intentions. So it's not it's typical for us to have unrestricted realized bequests that come in that help to support this enterprise. Historically, until the last 15 or 20 years, Caltech alums have really gone on into academia to be professors or research labs and things like that. And historically, they're not writing like outright checks or giving annual living alums giving percentage is actually in single digits. We've been working to try to change that. But bequests and planned gifts have been really, really productive for us. Recently, since I've been here in the last 7 years, we've also started working very respectfully with our faculty and our staff. And this year alone, we have 3 commitments that are documented that are 8-figure commitments. So 10, 15, $20 million commitments from faculty and staff who said, Caltech or the Jet Propulsion Lab, that's been the defining experience in my life, and I want to pass it on. For those of you who don't know, Caltech is really driven by curiosity, fundamental basic science. That's our bread and butter. Eventually, sometimes those things translate into, things that improve humanity or medicine and things like that. But we're driven by asking big questions that other people are not asking. Going back to the issue of where higher ed is, and I'll try to be brief, I believe that part of the growth that we've seen is because of the turbulence, is because of the targeting focus on higher education. And many of the individuals that have the wealth, they understand what higher ed meant to them, what higher ed meant in their lives, what higher ed meant to basically develop the workforce that they depend on that generated their wealth, what higher ed meant to their children, their parents. And I think that we benefited from that a little bit, where the rhetoric didn't match the lived experience of some of these philanthropists. We saw an increase as well, where people reached out, asked how we were doing, how are we faring. Luckily, we were not in the crosshairs like some of our peers. But people reached out to us and they wanted to support what we were doing, and I think we benefited from that. So I think I don't want to make this into a political thing, but the characterization that was really rampant, let's say a little over a year ago, I think most people understood that was not necessarily the reality, and they wanted to use their philanthropy to double down on the things that they cared about. Higher ed is not perfect. We're far from it. And I think as a result of some of the criticism, we're probably stronger and better because we have started to address some of the problems that we had in higher education, with a long way to go. So that I'll stop there because I don't want to go on much longer. But in general, I think that higher ed benefited by increased awareness, and then once again, a credibility that we actually do have versus some of the misunderstandings about what we do and how we do what we do.
Dexter, really helpful for the insights and experiences and overall overarching trends influencing certainly the program design and strategy at Caltech, but also donor psychology. Yeah. To be as generous as donors have proven to be, reflected in the 2025 data. Would love to pose a question to the three of you and Jon as well. One theme that came through strongly from the discussion here, and we know it from our work and our conversations with colleagues across the sector, is that some of the most reliable sources of funding for nonprofits across all sectors has become a bit more tumultuous. Government grants clearly are more volatile today than in years past. So I'd love, Dexter, Rebecca, Brent, if you have a perspective or insight in terms of how this shift is showing up in your world. And if you have advice about what organizations might do to consider, meeting this moment and circumnavigating the inherent challenge that it brings.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in on this. It's an obsession of mine right now. When we survey our nonprofits in Miami, 24% of them anticipate cuts as a result. And when you talk about government cuts for organizations that are receiving them, that's county level cuts, that's state level cuts, that's federal cuts. Usually if you're getting one, you're getting all three. And this is not $25,000 gifts. These are multi-$100,000, if not multi-million-dollar gifts. And like you said before, Brent, the majority of the gifts or the dollars that you're receiving, it's from a small share of very, very large gifts. What happens to a quarter of our nonprofits when their largest source of funding is cut off? They can't fix that with a couple $100 or even $10,000 fines. It's really not transferable. And so while normally my big strategy would be, if there's a few gifts that are going to be pulled away, you find a few new additional funders. And my focus has been, like you said before, Peter, on getting 100,000 people in Miami each to give, $50, $100, get everybody giving. But I don't think that tiny gifts, that small gifts, which matter a lot to the sustainability and the energy of a community, to the unity of a community, but that's not going to plug government shortfall when we see our largest institutions having their multi-million-dollar gifts cut. And so for the first time for me since I've been in this role, my solution has always been get more people to give. In this moment, I'm actually hyper-focusing for the first time on the largest givers, because in order to address these gaps, we need specific organizations to get very large specific gifts to cover for programs that really matter to our community. And it's the first time that that's been my focus, but I honestly think in this moment, for sustainability of those organizations, they need a small number of very large gifts to bridge them.
Thank you, Rebecca. Brent, Dexter, any added perspective?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, we're a little bit on eggshells. We've done okay. Last year, we actually ended up about 40 million ahead of our best year in federal funding. However, we believe that that had to do with program officers and departments front loading the funds, as if everybody remembers with Doge and those things were happening. We feel like people push dollars through the system. This year, we're a little bit behind on an indirect cost recovery. That could just be a delay for a number of reasons with what's going on in Washington. But, as we think about major grants, it's definitely a little bit more difficult. Decisions are a tad bit slower. And as I said, cost recovery is a little bit slower. Having said that, there are, for us as an institution, a research institution, there are many opportunities that are starting to present themselves across quantum, defense, AI, healthcare. There are things where, unlike many of Rebecca's clients, a university can pivot, and with a deep tech environment like ours, there are transitions that we can make that are probably harder for smaller nonprofits. So we're trying to kind of understand that through a lot of relationships in Washington, D.C., make sure our faculty are positioned in the right conversations with the right people at the right time. But having said that, there's a lot of uncertainty that we've experienced in the last few years when it comes to funding for research and higher ed. And we tend to remain cautious and to try to put our best foot forward at all times.
So Peter, for us in the healthcare space, about 2/3 of our patients rely on a government payer, and about 1/3 of our patients are commercially insured. And for children's healthcare expenses, they're covered through the Medicaid system. So that's going to vary a lot from state to state. We have yet to see how all that's going to play out in the longer term. The most immediate impact, where somewhat like Dexter was describing, we're still kind of waiting for the other shoe to drop, is really on basic science and research funding. And, to Rebecca's point, it does motivate donors, and they are open to hearing the stories about what those gaps are going to mean in the discovery process and what the practical impact of that might be down the road. And we are telling those stories. And several of them are excited to want to step up. And yet, honestly, philanthropy can't step up at scale, right? And so the impact is just too great. And it's still going to be a story that we're going to have to write through several years to come to really get all the chapters in the book and see what the hit is that we're taking.
Thank you, Brent, Rebecca, Dexter. There's so much that we could get to, and we haven't. Corporate giving, the overarching economic indicators and the implications on the philanthropic data, the subsector information. But I think in honor of the time that we committed and the thousands of gatherers who have convened for this release, let's move to a closing question, if that's okay. I'd like to just go around to each of you for a final thought. Looking at everything that we've discussed, all of the great data that Jon shared today, record total giving, a shift toward bequests and foundations, and a slightly softer year for individuals, as well as your own experience and perspective, which we're so glad that you've been able to reveal in conversation here. What's one piece of advice that you're thinking about that you're able to extend to a fellow nonprofit leader, CEO, advancement head, a board member, a donor even, about where their focus and energy should be in 2026? What might that advice be?
Thank you, Peter. I'm happy to start. Basically, I think that the current trends that we've talked about today and the challenges ahead are going to be with us for a while. And as a result, if I were running a small nonprofit, I would really focus on what my mission is, what my differentiation is, I would think about creative things around how to get my board activated. They can make investments to help support additional fundraising. I would think hard about talent, and this is an uncomfortable thing to say, but make sure you have the best people in your office doing the right work at the right time. I do believe that the challenges for higher ed and across the board ahead will continue, but this is the time to focus. It's the time to strengthen up and to really think about the impact that you're all making. I do want to thank everybody for the amazing work that you do. I find it to be a great privilege of my life to be in the nonprofit sector. And so I thank all of you for all the work you've done.
Thanks a ton, Dexter. Appreciate that.
So happy to chime in with my closing thought. And I know there's a variety of board members who are tuning in today. So this one is for you all, which
Nice.
is, if I were to focus on one thing right now, it is people first. A few years ago in 2020, we watched our nonprofit leaders step forward and stretch themselves beyond the capacity of what human beings should have to do at work. Thinking that we were living through the largest social, health, and economic crisis, not only of our lifetimes, but of the last 100 years or more. And we thought, on the other side of this, there would be some rest. And the challenge is that during that time, our nonprofits, they scaled the work that they were doing because the need was so high, and also the funding was there for them to stretch in that way. And there was a cliff at the end of that, funding wise, that we're now seeing when you match that with the government cuts that are coming as well right now. Our nonprofits are responding to like a real withdrawal of resources. And this was after they stretched. The need is still there at the same level. And what I'm watching, and it's an unspoken wrong that we are all watching in our communities across the country, is the leaders who step forward to defend all of the issues that we care about and rely upon in each one of our neighborhoods, who have had to sustain through really, really hard work. And now through, I think, what will be a year of sustained hard work with less resources than before. It's a stress. And I think the funding will come and go in different ways. There will be seasons for that, but we need the leaders in our communities who step forward bravely for all the issue areas we care about to be strong on the other side of this. And so whether it is a good year or a bad year financially, whether it's corporate dollars or bequest dollars, I feel like matters less than the health and strength of our people. And so I would lean in real hard right now and take a look and diagnose not just who's going to meet goal, but actually how are your people doing?
Really helpful, poignant. Thank you, Rebecca. Thanks for directing it to the board members among us as well.
That's great. So I'll certainly endorse what Rebecca has just offered and Dexter has offered, and try to add to them maybe one slightly additional different thought at the end. We all know that for a donor to make a gift, they have to have something to give, they have to want to give it, and there has to be a reason for them to give now, right? That's the magic algorithm, whether you're talking about a program officer with a foundation or someone at a corporation that's responsible for their corporate philanthropy, or a decision that an individual or family's trying to make. And the biggest influence on all those fronts for that algorithm of motivating someone to want to give and to help them understand why giving now is important all ties back to the power of storytelling. And we're investing in so many great strategies now that are data-driven, and certainly the data are important, and AI-enabled technologies and all these other things. But we all have to keep, I think, in the forefront for us that in philanthropy especially, we are storytellers. And the power of a story to effectively communicate those data and to do it in a compelling way that prompts someone to be inspired to want to give and to understand why they should give now is incredibly, incredibly powerful. And that's always front and center.
Thank you, Brent. Jon, do you want to take us home?
Sure.
Would you mind?
I will be pretty short and blunt. I'll sort of double down on what Rebecca was saying of like, find the big donors. Find whether that is a wealthy individual in your community or in your sector, or if that is a big foundation or planned gift, or however you need to do it. This, there will be time to widen out that donor pool in hopefully better times. Now is a time to reflect on what the situation is and optimize what you can do, which is target the big fish.
Thanks, John. Dexter, Brent, Rebecca, thank you. Thanks for this discussion. Thanks for engaging with us. We really value your experience, your leadership, the wisdom that has provided, and your willingness to share it with us. So thank you. The participation really means a lot. Today's data clearly reminds us that philanthropy continues to grow and evolve, but it also challenges us to be more strategic, more donor-centered, more people-centered, and more intentional in terms of how we advance our planning and our execution into the future. So a great discussion. The recording of today's discussion for all participants will be shared this week, in fact, in just a few days. And just to close out here, on behalf of CCS Fundraising, the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, Giving USA, the panel, and all of today's presenters and participants, thank you a ton for joining us, and have a great day.
Thanks for having me. Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thanks.